Okay, so for this section, we are going to be looking over a few different Excel lookup functions. And lookup functions help us find certain values within our data set. So the first lookup function that we are going to discuss is the VLOOKUP function. Now the VLOOKUP function is one of the most popular functions used in Excel. And the best way to demonstrate what this function does is to apply it to our example and then explain what the function is doing along the way. So before we begin, I want to point out that we will be working inside the VLOOKUP sheet tab, so make sure you have this sheet selected. And for our example, our goal is to be able to search by student ID number and then have the VLOOKUP function return the name and the score associated to that ID number. So let's try to retrieve the name of a student ID first. We can click in the cell next to name, and then also I'm going to zoom in into our sheet a little bit. Alright, so to insert our function, we need to type in the equal sign and then start typing VLOOKUP. And then you can select tab on your keyboard to insert this function. So let's open up the function arguments window and see what Excel defines this function as and what arguments is needed for this function to work. So let's click this FX button next to our formula bar. And we can read here that the VLOOKUP function looks for a value in the leftmost column of a table, and then returns a value in the same row from a column you specify. So for our first argument is the lookup value, which is the value to be found in the first column of the table. So for our lookup value, it will be the ID number that we put in this cell, G2. And this value can be found in the leftmost column of the table. And this is a super important piece of information because if your lookup value is not in the first column of the table, this function will not work properly. And I also want to mention that the V in VLOOKUP stands for vertical lookup. So it's looking at the top of our list down to the bottom of our list. And then for our next argument is the table array, which is a table of text, numbers, or logical values in which the data is retrieved. So we need to specify the range of cells that our value lives within. So for our table array, we can select our whole table. Now currently this range is A1 to D14. But if this range of cells was a table, or we defined a name for this range, we can use the table name or the name range for our table array. But since our list is not converted into a table and we didn't define a name for it, we will just stick with A1 to D14. And for our third argument is the column index number, which is the column number in the table array from which the matching value should be returned. Okay, so for this function, what we are trying to achieve is to search for an ID number and return the name associated to that ID. And our name column is the second column within our list. We have 1, 2. So for our column index number, we would need to type in 2. And then for our last argument, the range lookup, we have a few different options. We can either find the closest match in the first column or find an exact match. Now usually when you're dealing with VLOOKUP functions, you want to find an exact match. And down here it says that we could put false to find an exact match, or you can type in 0, which equals false. You can do either one. I just like typing in 0 because it's quicker and the formula is a little bit shorter. So if we click OK, currently we are getting ANA. Now this might look like an error, but it's really not. It's just that this function is not finding anything because we haven't specified an ID number. So if we type in an ID number, our VLOOKUP function should return the name of that ID. So if we type in 110, our function returns Corey. Because over here in our list, if we search for the ID number of 110, we can see the name associated to this ID is Corey. And then if we come back over here and change the ID to 117, we get Jake. If we come back to our list, search for 117, the name is Jake for that ID. So let's use this VLOOKUP function to return the score as well. Now I want to be able to just copy this formula down a row. But before we do that, we need to make sure that within our formula, we are using the correct cell references. So if we come up to our formula bar, we have G2 as our lookup value. Now that lookup value will always remain the same. So we need to make this cell reference an absolute value. So we can press F4 on our keyboard to make it absolute, so that when we copy this formula down, our lookup value still remains in the ID cell. We also need to make our table array an absolute reference, because our range will not change when we are copying this formula down. So we can press F4 again and click enter. So now if we come to our cell and drag the fill handle down, well, we are still getting Jake for our score. Well, that's because we haven't changed the column index number yet. So for score, that's in the third column of our list, 1, 2, 3. So what we need to do is come up to our formula bar and edit this 2 to a 3. And if we click enter, now for the ID number of 117, we have the name Jake, and then we can see that his score was 74. And if we come over to our list, 117 is Jake, and he scored a 74. Now there is one more thing about the VLOOKUP function that I want to point out, is that the VLOOKUP function always returns the first match. And let me show you what I mean by that. So if I add a row between Trevor and Kate, and Trevor has an ID number of 114. Well, if I put in another ID number of 114, and let's say this person is John, and he scored an 85, if I come up to the ID cell and search for 114, let's see what our function returns. It returned Trevor, and he scored a 90. So even though that Trevor and John both share the same ID number, the VLOOKUP function will always return the first match. So when you are working inside your spreadsheets and using this function, it's always a good idea to make sure that your table doesn't have any duplicated values, or you can sort your table and double check that what your VLOOKUP function is returning is the correct value that you want. And remember that your lookup value always has to be in the leftmost column of your table. So if we move this ID column around in our table, our VLOOKUP function would not work. So that's how you use the VLOOKUP function. It's one of Excel's most powerful functions, and it gets used every day.